Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, 2026 is going to be a big year in municipal politics. Ontario's 444 municipalities will elect new mayors, reeves, and councillors, and we're going to tell you a little bit about what to expect as things heat up in the months to come.
At this point, you've probably heard about the Ring of Fire, the mineral deposit in Ontario's far northwest. We'll talk with reporter Liam Casey about its future and what it could mean for Indigenous people in the region.
It's Friday, January 30th, 2026, so let's get to it. JMM?
Steve?
A little streetcar sugar to get things started today, eh?
Yes, I am living in hope of eventually boarding the Eglinton Crosstown LRT.
Don't we all?
Which is supposed to open at some point in the near future. And so I thought I would wear this shirt today as some kind of appeal to the gods that transit will once again be part of the city's future.
That's great. Now, what vintage would that be, that streetcar, do you think?
I think this was the maybe either pre-World War II or just immediately post-World War II streetcars. Certainly, there were not many of them left on the streets of the city when I've moved here in like 91.
No kidding. No, that's a classic. That is absolutely good. There's none of those still in.
No, they're certainly gone. Not currently on the streets.
Yeah. Okay, just checking. Well, I have a shirt that people were wearing 13 years ago this week, some people anyway, at a leadership convention which took place at Maple Leaf Gardens, at which the Ontario Liberal Party made history. Yes, indeed. This was the T-shirt that Team Wynne wore as Kathleen Wynne won the leadership convention and became, as a result of winning that convention, the first female premier in the history of the province of Ontario. This was one of the most dramatic leadership conventions I remember covering, because the conventional wisdom going in was that Sandra Pupatello, who was a former minister in the McGuinty government and who was actually out of politics at that moment, that she was likely going to have a strong lead on the first ballot going in, and the question was, could Wynne catch up on subsequent ballots? And then they announced the results of the first ballot, and it was practically a tie. It was 599 to 597 for Pupatello. And suddenly there was a big, there was a feeling in the room that, this thing is not going to be a fait accompli for Sandra Pupatello after all. And in fact, Wynne passed her on the second ballot and did win on the third ballot. How did that happen? I think that happened because Kathleen Wynne gave what I still believe is the greatest Convention Day speech I have ever seen at any leadership convention, federally or provincially, and I've seen a lot of them over my years. There was a lot of gossip and quietly had discussions in the lead up to that convention about whether an openly gay candidate could win the leadership of a political party and become the premier. And, Kathleen Wynne got out there, and instead of kind of pussyfooting around with this, she went right for it during her convention speech. And she said, are we really at a place in the 21st century in the province of Ontario where if you are gay, you cannot aspire to having leadership roles in politics? And that speech, I could feel it in the room. That speech moved people in the room so much that you could feel a lot of the wind come out of the Pupatello campaign, and it went right to the Wynne campaign. And of course, Kathleen Wynne actually won by a reasonably strong amount. Now, I think one other thing, which may have some relevance for today as well. Wynne had a seat in the legislature at Queen's Park.
Yes.
Pupatello did not.
Yes.
And that may be something that people who are running for leader of the Ontario Liberal Party want to keep in mind right now. We've got a picture of Kathleen Wynne I want to show you here, because she's 72 years old now, still does some teaching at Victoria College, and there's a teacher in the Toronto board named Mark Chire who actually sent me this picture. This is Kathleen Wynne, who went to Mark Chire's grade 5 class and talked to the kids, which I think is pretty cool.
Yes.
She doesn't need to do that, but there she was out there.
And she was a school board trustee before she entered provincial politics. And so,
and an education minister.
Education always been an issue close to her heart, I think. You mentioned the speech, and I think, I don't know whether it's conventional wisdom or whether you just simply accept it as a fact that, most of the time, most speeches, they might be dramatic, but they don't matter that much.
They don't have an impact.
They don't have an impact. And that's what is so unique about that 2013 Kathleen Wynne speech, that it wasn't just that it was a well-written speech or that it came to be seen as important, with the passage of time, but it was incredibly important in that moment. She literally, figuratively, literally moved the needle, appealed to voters who she needed in that room at that moment. And
because it was a delegated convention. It was a delegated convention,
Yes.
and everybody hadn't voted already.
Yes.
And as a result, candidates dropped off the ballot. I remember Eric Hoskins was the MPP for this area, Toronto St. Paul's. He dropped off the ballot. A lot of people think he had an agreement to go to Sandra Pupatello, but he, like many others, heard that speech by Kathleen Wynne, and instead he dropped off and went to Wynne.
Yes.
And that, changed the momentum, and the rest, as they say, is history.
yes, absolutely.
Anyway, and with that, let's get off to issue one. 2025 saw elections at both the Ontario and national levels in Canada, but if you were hoping to go a year without being called to the ballot box, sorry, you're out of luck. 2026 will see the province's regularly scheduled election for municipal councils in 444 municipalities. JMM, obviously early going here.
Yes.
Campaigns don't officially start for several months yet, but at this stage of the game, what do you think we need to know?
So let's start with the basics, right? Election day will be October 26th for all municipalities. Voters will be asked to cast ballots for mayors, councillors, other local officials in their municipality. If you are a person who owns two properties in different municipalities, you can be eligible to vote in multiple municipalities. For example, if you own a cottage or camp in one community, you may be eligible to vote in that community as well. You can be either a resident voter or a non-resident voter if you own a property but don't live in that community full time. Now, I said October 26th will be voting day, but for many offices in many parts of the province, though we don't know which ones yet, that actually will not be the date that the election is decided. It's very common, particularly in rural and northern areas, for the election to be functionally decided when nominations close, which this year will be on Friday, August 21st. When those nominations close, if you don't have your paperwork in, you are out of luck. You will not be a candidate in this year's election. If prior election cycles are any guide, hundreds of races that day in August will be the election because candidates will be acclaimed. There will only be one registered candidate in that race. Just to give people an example, in 2022, 32 different municipalities had their entire councils acclaimed. And then 100 other municipalities had at least one office, a mayor or a councillor, acclaimed as well. The Association of Municipalities of Ontario tracks this pretty consistently. And I think every election cycle that I have tracked since I became a reporter, the number of people acclaimed into these offices is always several hundred at least.
Which means one of two things. Either those candidates are doing such a fantastic job that nobody wants to run against them because it's hopeless, or these jobs are getting so difficult to do,
Yes.
and the blowback that you get from so many constituents is so miserable and awful that people don't want to do these jobs anymore. And is that ever a problem if that's the case?
Yeah, and that is absolutely a problem. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But yeah, the other issue I would say is that, in a lot of these communities, even if you don't necessarily think that the incumbent is doing a spectacular job, often a lot of people just see the act of running for election as a big barrier, quite aside from the level of acrimony and hostility that there is in politics generally these days.
Now, if my memory serves, and occasionally it does, school boards have elections on the same day. How about this year?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? Minister of Education Paul Calandra has spent much of the last year saying that he is looking at root and branch changes to the structure of school boards in Ontario, specifically the English public school boards. He has said that he will probably be leaving the Catholic school boards and the French school boards alone. They have various constitutional protections. So we don't know for sure what the reform that he is proposing is going to look like. We aren't really going to know in detail until a bill is actually presented to the legislature. But a lot of observers in the sector have concluded that we are not going to have elected school board trustees any longer. what alternative form of government will be in place instead is not clear. But for the purposes of the election cycle, I think it's entirely possible that hundreds, if not, gosh, I don't even know, but possibly thousands of school board trustees around the province will no longer have offices to run for re-election in.
Which is kind of amazing, since the school board trustee job is the oldest job in politics in this country.
Yes.
I mean, it predates Confederation.
Yes, we've had elected school boards longer than we've had any other elected office, certainly any other elected office of any consequence. I don't think the Ontario legislature had an elected chamber, because it would have been Upper Canada back then.
Yeah.
But these are some of the oldest elected institutions, and we could be saying goodbye to them.
Yeah, who knows? We are going to look at some specific races around the province, but before we do that, any other context we need to know here?
Yeah, so we already talked just a little bit about some of the acrimony in politics generally, and one of the stories that we have been tracking at TVO for the last year has been the introduction of Bill 9 after the election last year. This was supposed to create a province-wide code of conduct for municipal elected officials and standardize and harmonize some of the rules around potentially removing elected officers for serious misconduct. Bill 9 went through a lengthy period of consultations over last summer, was brought back to the legislature in the fall. A committee passed it. They did not make any of the substantive amendments that reformers had wanted. And perhaps, I will say, most galling of all, the government never called it for third reading in the fall sitting. So it has just sat there in limbo through the entire fall sitting, which, if you now look forward on the calendar, the earliest it could be passed would be in the spring sitting, which is already going to start later than it was intended to. Functionally, that means that I think it's very unlikely that this law will be in place before the next municipal election. And there are some misbehaving counselors.
Well,
that's
the point. I mean, we've been hearing from a lot of, when we go to, AMO or Roma, you often hear plaintive pleas to the ministers who come for these barefoot sessions from local councillors around Ontario who are saying, please, finally, we've been asking for this for years. We need a code of conduct here. Let's go.
Yeah, and it hasn't happened yet. And so there's a lot of frustration there. And there's also some weird ways where this problem of, let's just say broadly describe it as city councillors who, some of them are playing to bases on social media. Other people are just acting poorly in more conventional ways, if I could put it that way. But it also, it is interacting in a weird way with the strong mayor powers that the government has. It initially introduced in Ottawa and Toronto, and it is now spread to many other municipalities in the province. Last August, Strategy Corp released a report. They do this report every year where they interview the chief administrative officers of municipalities, and it's all anonymous so that CAOs can speak their minds. And one of the things that they heard was that they are seeing people people in the communities. And of course, these are people who are citizens and they have the right to run for elected office, but they are loudly proclaiming their intention to run for mayor's races in their community, specifically so they can target high-level civil servants in those municipalities, which is that's a big change in local politics. People basically using these elections as settling grudges. And so obviously, we don't know for sure that is going to happen, but it is a concern that people have raised, and we're going to have to see how it plays out.
Let's look at a handful of races around the province of Ontario. We want to start here in the capital city, where, interestingly enough, the current mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, has not indicated whether she's in fact going to run for re-election, although given the state of the last budget and the 2.2% tax increase, which is much smaller than previous budget tax increases, I think the smart money's on yes, she is.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the City of Toronto is currently in the middle of its budget process. And as you say, Mayor Chow has proposed a 2.2% property tax increase on homeowners. And that would be in line with inflation. And that has been sort of the political bargain of mayors now going back several cycles of particularly around election time, keeping that tax increase to about the rate of inflation. And, that's the kind of political move that you could say that Chow would want to be able to sell voters in a re-election campaign, even if she hasn't formally declared it yet, right? She, of course, had adopted larger tax increases in previous years, but, she can go to voters now and say, like, that was necessary to get the city's finances under control, but now we've got that spending under control. We should also note, this is another tea leaf that we can read or something like that. Late last year, the TTC announced that it was going to adopt something called fare capping, which is something that other jurisdictions have done where no matter how many times you use a transit service in a month, you would only get charged a certain maximum. And so instead of having to, for example, prepay for your transit pass at the beginning of the month, every month, now you have a bit more flexibility. And so it's a very popular policy. And you might ask, gee, when will this policy come into effect? Well, I hear you asking that. And the answer is September 1st, 2026. Now, I would never, of course, be so cynical as to suggest that this is timed to the election in October.
Never. There
is a reasonable argument that, students are going back to school on September 1st. People are coming back from their summer vacations on September 1st. There's a totally plausible reason why that, that makes sense for when the policy should start. But I also have to imagine that the election has something to do with that timing as well.
Now, technically, of course, you can't file your papers to run for mayor until the 1st of May, I think this
that's
year.
Right, yes.
So we're in a bit of a phony war right now because technically nobody's in the race yet at all. However, somebody from Toronto City Council has announced he's in it to win it, and that is?
Beaches East York councillor Brad Bradford happens to be my councillor. I live in his ward. He ran in the 2023 by-election that, of course, Chow prevailed in. And I just speak plainly, he did not make a particularly strong showing in the citywide results in that election. But, there were a lot of different candidates in that race, and he was unable at that time to consolidate the conservative support in the city behind his campaign. I think it's fair to say he was probably going to have better luck this time. I think there's already been a lot more movement to Bradford's side, and we haven't seen another conservative challenger to Olivia Chow with quite that level of support yet. That might still happen, of course. In fact, I'm quite certain there will be more candidates. Every election of Toronto City Council that I've ever covered, the mayor's race has dozens of candidates, and I suspect that we are in for that again. But so far, those are the two highest profile candidates.
Well, we do have to mention one more name here. And obviously, the reason Olivia Chow is the mayor of Toronto today is because the previous mayor resigned the office under circumstances we don't need to go into again because everybody knows. But the reality is John Tory is certainly out there making his phone calls, having his meetings, doing some polling, trying to determine if he does run for his old job back, how competitive a race would he be able to put forward. So I'm not sure he's decided yet himself, but certainly a lot of people are waiting to see, and particularly as it relates to Brad Bradford, they're holding off their endorsements of Bradford because they want to find out what John Tory's status is. So that's the big name we're still waiting to hear about.
That is the name we are still waiting on. As somebody who started covering politics in 2010, that was like the first election after I left journalism school. Every single election cycle in Toronto that I have ever covered has involved speculation about whether John Tory is either running or running again.
That's right, actually, right?
Yeah. So, in some sense, this is all very familiar. One thing that we have seen in the polls is that if this is a three-person race with Chow, Tory, and Brad Bradford, Olivia Chow wins because the conservative side of the vote is divided. And so I think there is going to be immense pressure placed on either Bradford or Tory to clear the lane, so to speak, and keep it to as much as is possible in, as I say, an election that is likely to have dozens of candidates to keep it a clean sort of one-on-one fight.
Brad Bradford makes this point. I'm not sure it's a perfect analogy, but I'll put it out there anyway. There was a race in 2014 in which there were two right-wing candidates, yes, John Tory and Doug Ford, who had taken up the mantle of his brother. And Olivia Chow was in that race too. And despite the fact that there were two center-right candidates in that race, Tory won. So it's not impossible. Bradford's making the argument. It's not impossible that even with two center-right candidates in the race, one of them can win. Now, circumstances today would be different from back then.
Yes.
But I put it out there just in the interest of stirring up a little more controversy.
Yes.
There we go. All right, let's move on. Right next door to the west, Mississauga. What are you hearing?
So would you believe that it has only been a bit over 2 years since Bonnie Crombie resigned as mayor of Mississauga after winning the Liberal leadership? I mean,
How long does it feel?
2025 feels like it was an entire decade to me. That was a long year. Anyway, it is possible that we will see a rematch of kind, with some speculation that Crombie will run for her old job as mayor of Mississauga, pitting her against Carolyn Parrish, who has said that she will run again. The last time the two faced off against each other was in 2014 when Crombie succeeded longtime mayor Hazel McCallion. Crombie had McCallion's blessing as her sort of successor. This time around, Parrish will be the incumbent and Crombie will not have the late mayor's explicit support. So this could be a very interesting race to watch.
Carolyn Parrish is, I think, 80 years old. If she's not 80, she's about to turn 80. And of course, by Mississauga standards, she's a junior candidate at that level. I think, how old was Hazel McCallion by the time she stepped down?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it was well into her 90s.
Yes.
Well into her 90s.
And she'd been mayor for, what, 40 years?
Almost. Yeah, something like that. Let's go east. What about the nation's capital?
Right. So in Ottawa, Mark Sutcliffe will be running for re-election and is being challenged by progressive Jeff Leaper, the councillor for that city's Kitchissippi ward. Obviously, we are going to wait to see this campaign develop, but in broad strokes, Leaper has criticized Sutcliffe's time as mayor for not investing in city services to the levels needed, while Sutcliffe has said he's prioritized lower taxes and spending restraint. In general, I think it is fair to say that challengers have the harder job in Ontario municipal elections. So, I think it's fair to say that Leaper has a tough hill to climb, but we will see how this race develops in the year ahead.
And just because this is the OnPoli podcast and we like to find the Ontario political angles, let's look at three former leaders from Queen's Park who are mayors today and what their situations are. Stephen Del Duca in Vaughan, Andrea Horwath in Hamilton, Patrick Brown in Brampton.
Yes.
So far from what I'm hearing, Del Duca's going again, Brown's going again. Don't know about Horwath in Hamilton yet. I don't think she said whether she's seeking re-election or not. Yeah. And Hamilton is a tough city to win re-election is. I think almost all of the last 20 years worth of mayors, maybe more, have had one term and out. It's very difficult to win re-election in Hamilton.
And then there was one where I'm blanking on the name, so I apologize, but it all got wrapped up in the argument over, should the city's priority be LRT or GO transit expansion? And so there was like a series of elections where one candidate was out and then back in and then out again.
That's right.
And so, it's a competitive marketplace in Hamilton, let me put it that way.
Indeed. And, Andrea Horwath won last time by such a very tiny margin. Yeah. So she no doubt will be considering that again, as will her challenger from last time, Keenan Loomis. So lots of great races to keep our eyes on, which we shall.
Yes, absolutely.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. For nearly 20 years, multiple governments at Queen's Park have promised to develop the Ring of Fire, a mineral deposit in Ontario's far northwest. Now it might actually be happening, with construction of an access road slated to begin later this year. The people most directly affected by development in the region are Indigenous. They have faced a long history of broken promises by Canadian governments. Late last year, reporter Liam Casey of the Canadian Press wrote about the First Nations in the region, and he joins us now for more. Liam, it's great to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, guys.
First time in our studio, right?
Yeah. Beautiful new studio.
Excellent. Yeah, good to have you here. Let's, we want to put a little bit of background into place, first of all. So let's find out about the Webequie and the Neskantaga First Nations, whom I think you describe as cousins. Tell us more about them. Yeah,
so we wanted to go up north. Big news in the spring session last year at Queen's Park with Bill 5 over, the special economic zone that the government has created, which would suspend laws and with the idea of trying to speed up development. So the idea was we wanted to go up to this place that is fairly remote. There's no roads, but there is a lot of activity happening up there with the mining companies. And, there's several First Nations that kind of circle around the Ring of Fire, Webequie First Nation and Nisga'a First Nation, and they're taking, fairly different approaches to development.
How so?
Webquay has sort of realized that mining is going to happen, and they want a hand on the wheel. They want to be able to have input. They want a seat at the table, and they want to use development to lift themselves out of poverty. You know, these both Webquay and Nisga'a are remote fly-in First Nations. You can get up there in the winter on an ice road, but these ice road seasons are shrinking because of climate change. Right. So they have to bring in all their supplies. If they want to build a house, that has to come in on the ice road. So everything sort of has, this delicate dance in the wintertime to be able to do anything. And Nisga'a is sort of, taking a bit of a different tack in that they have a lot of issues that they want solved first before they start thinking about development. Both sort of realize climate change is coming. The north is changing. It's changing much quicker in the north compared to the south. The climate change is about 2 to 4 times more quickly it's happening. They want a road in principle. Webquay really wants a road. And so it's sort of twofold. Webquay would like development. They want to be part of that decision making. But they also want a road so they can, an all season road, so that they can bring in supplies, throughout the year. And those are sort of the two things they want to help lift themselves up.
And they're also divided. I mean, historically, they had different experiences of the colonial contact as well, right?
Yeah. So Webquay basically is a branch off of Nisga'a, and Webquay is largely Anglican, and Nisga'a is largely Catholic. So this is sort of, the South kind of brought up religion, right? And they dealt with the horrific residential school systems and day schools. And, in many ways, they're still dealing with the trauma that came with that. So there's just a lot of like actual cousins, in Webquay and Nisga'a. They know each other pretty well. They're about a 15-minute flight from each other, but they're sort of worlds apart in how they see the future.
Let me get back to this road. If and when this road ultimately gets built, what impact is it going to have up there on those communities?
So they have a lot of worries about the road, and they still need to kind of figure out who's going to kind of control the road, who might own the road. There's a lot still to be kind of worked out. What we were hearing when we were up there is that on the bright side, they can get, medication, they can leave for health appointments, they can do a whole bunch of positive things for the road. The flip side is, even these remote First Nations are not, they are dealing with, the opioid crisis. These are, Nisga'a is a dry community. They are really worried about the road kind of opening up even more access to drugs coming into the community. They are also worried just about sort of hunting tourists coming up from the south. Both First Nations do not want that. So there's a lot of worry about what the road will actually bring. Some good, but also some bad.
That's interesting, because if you listen to politicians at Queen's Park, the road is an unambiguously good thing, and they've been trying to get it in for a decade. There's another side to the story, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think the old road to save the people in Nisga'a, like they don't, to your earlier point about not trusting governments, they're worried that, it's not just going to be one mine. This road will, be a thoroughfare for other mining companies to start building. There are 4 companies in the Ring of Fire right now. Wailu is sort of the big dog right now, and they're probably the furthest ahead, but there's 3 other companies that are doing a whole bunch of exploring up there. There's some recent claims that they've found a whole bunch of gold. Wailu's big play up there is nickel. There's also chromite, so a bunch of these things that we hear kind of talked about all the time, including from American President Donald Trump. They need nickel. They need a whole bunch of these critical minerals.
I thought they didn't need anything from us. He's been saying that all the time. You have nothing we need. You have nothing we want. We want nothing from you guys.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's entirely true. But
I'm shocked.
But I guess he's entitled to his own opinions.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about Geronimo Katakwapit and his family.
Okay, so I first spoke to Geronimo in, I got to say, June, and he went on this epic journey with his family from Attawapiskat First Nation along the coast of James Bay, and they, it was more than 400 what the family calls river kilometers up the Attawapiskat, and And they sort of met with people from Niskananga, and they wanted to do something to show people, hey, it's not just desolate land up here. There are people here. We are hunting and we are living. So they started to build an encampment around where a bridge is going to cross the Attawapiskat. So I was very intrigued by it when I spoke to him on the phone, and they were traveling up with they had a generator in their giant freighter canoe, and so they had Starlink. So I was able to talk to him while he was in the canoe going up, and I just thought wouldn't it be great if I could actually make it to the Ring of Fire, the actual Ring of Fire. So I started thinking about that after I was speaking to Geronimo. So when we were able to miraculously kind of pull off this trip, which was logistically challenging, and we made it to this crossing, and there's a couple of teepees there. There's a kitchen with counters, like everything's kind of, supplies are being flown in from Niskananga First Nation, and they've built up this little kind of community, and they want to keep kind of building it up. And the idea is that they will be there if and when this road shows up in 5 to 10 years or whenever that may be.
And that it may not be a blockade exactly, but they're asserting their sovereignty over that land.
Yeah, and they got little signs put up, on in the middle of the bush that says exactly that, John. This is our land. We don't, give consent to the mining companies, for a road or for any of these sort of minerals extractions that they want to do. And it's basically just to say, hey, we're here.
There have been on television of late a lot of commercials about the Ring of Fire. It's pretty hard, if you're watching local news or you're watching a ball game or something like that, or a hockey game, not to bump into these Ring of Fire ads. What do the locals in Northwestern Ontario think about those ads?
So we were actually up there when the ads first started to run. We were in Niskananga. We had just gotten out of Webequie. And so in Niskananga, they communicate. The cell phones don't work up there. So they have these walkie-talkies that they call black radios, the little black walkie-talkies. They call them BRs. And that was just lighting up the next day talking about this commercial. So they were just livid. A few of them told me, the former chief, Chris Munoz, told me he wanted to throw his TV against the wall. When they're a lot of people in the community were watching the Jays, and this was game 1 of the World Series when we were up there, and it just it landed like a bomb. And,
what was the problem?
well, Niskananga is not really in favor of this, and this commercial basically says, the Ring of Fire is the solution to all of Canada's problems. But they were like, well, what about our problems? Talking about Protect Ontario, Premier Doug Ford's favorite saying the last year, and they were saying, well, what about Protect Niskananga? Like, what about us? We got a lot of issues that we would dealt with. So it was. So it did not go over well in Niskananga, and it was interesting to be there at that time because we were watching it too, and we were in the Ring of Fire region. We're like, well, this is crazy, So it was good timing for us journalistically, but yeah, it did not go over well where we were.
This isn't a climate change story exactly, but whether it's the ice road season that you mentioned, or even water levels on the Attawapiskat River, climate change is an integral part of all of this. What did the people who live in the North tell you about how they're experiencing climate change?
I spoke a lot about this in both First Nations and in Webequie. They were telling me about the winter road season and all the challenges they're facing with it. And they're saying, a couple of decades ago, it'd be no problem to get 5 feet of ice. And you sort of need a certain amount of ice to be able to handle different weights, right? Including transport trucks that come up with all these supplies in the wintertime. So they were talking a lot about something they call blue ice, which is basically, once it freezes, there's no melting. So it's just pure kind of frozen ice. There's no kind of slush that would get involved that would kind of make it a bit more white. And they're just saying, we're just losing a lot of this blue ice. That it makes the ice a lot stronger, and we're having to do a lot more work to kind of build up roads in advance. So, building up the roads takes even more time, right? So that's eating into the winter road season. In Niskananga, they sort of have accepted the fact that, climate change is really having an effect on the winter roads. They're really not sure about the roads, but they sort of accept the idea that they're going to kind of need a road at some point to be able to kind of survive and hopefully thrive, But I think they're still coming to grips with How is that going to come about, and will they have sort of a say?
Liam, the relationship between Queen's Park and Parliament Hill, how does that affect the future of the Ring of Fire?
Well, I think right now the big thing that Ontario wants from the federal government is money. The feds have not stepped up with any sort of money. The province, back to the days of McGuinty and Wynne, have pledged $1 billion to help build this road. It's going to cost a lot more than $1 billion. It's hard to get an exact figure out of the government, but it's going to be several $billion at least. Construction costs are going up.
Yes.
It's very expensive to build anything up north, let alone, 3 sort of sections of roads that are going to be hundreds of kilometers long. So this presents a lot of challenges. It's going to be interesting to see, honestly, if they can actually do it. It's going to be an engineering kind of marvel. But I was also struck by the fact that they're already building a lot up there. When we flew over the mining site, there's a lot of things being built. There's a lot of work happening. And it's just kind of incredible to see what humans can kind of do just in the middle of nowhere.
And this is not a 4-lane, 400 series style highway we're talking about. We're talking about a 2-lane gravel road, but it's just so long and through such rough terrain that the cost, as you say, $1 billion is the opening estimate. It's likely to be substantially more.
So they want money from the feds. Ontario got something that they've been advocating for in December with this deal that they signed with the federal government on reducing regulatory burdens, sort of, this idea, the Ontario environmental assessment, versus the federal impact assessment. And, there is a lot of duplication between the two, which is what the province argues. And they wanted basically the feds to kind of step out of the way and not to have to do all this duplicative work. I
thought that was over now, though. I thought they've come to an agreement that they're not going to be competing with environmental assessment.
Yes, that's what happened in December. So that was those were basically the two asks that the provincial government wanted. They wanted this regulatory portion of building the road dealt with, and the feds are on board with that. But there's still no money from the feds yet.
Saul Mamakwa represents the riding of Kowetnung, and he had something really interesting that he told you about what he sees as the future of Indigenous politics in Canada. What did he say?
Yeah, so I've gotten to know Saul pretty well at Queen's Park, and he's a really interesting man.
Yeah.
He's also the lone First Nation provincial representative, right? So I think he carries a big weight when guys like me are always going to him for a general First Nation reaction to whatever the story of the day is, right? And so he has been kind of talking about, maybe they can learn something from, parties like the Bloc, where if they were able to band together First Nations across the country, they figure there's upwards of 36 ridings where First Nations are the dominant population. So he has this idea like maybe they can do politics a little bit differently if they had sort of a strong kind of First Nation party that could represent their interests, countrywide. And so he feels that they could be a lot stronger that way and able to use that political heft to further, what they want in Ottawa.
That's very interesting, because up until now, First Nations who want to get involved in politics have always kind of done it through established parties. They haven't talked about creating their own movement or their own political party. Is anybody actually organized? It's an idea. Anybody organizing it?
As far as I know, it's just an idea right now.
I see.
Okay. But it's an intriguing idea.
It is intriguing. Although, your story and other reporters who have reported on this, the idea of a Indigenous or a First Nations party in Canadian politics, your own story exposes it's not a monolithic politics in Indigenous communities, right? You've got divisions between Webequien and Niskandaga, and I'm certain even within those communities as well, right? Indigenous people are not a monolith any more than any other community in Canada is. Mm-hmm. So a very, very intriguing idea on MPP Mamakwa's part, but some distance between here and there.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Let me ask the wonderful all-purpose question that we journalists are trained to ask at the end of every interview, which is, anything we haven't asked you that you want to advance before we leave?
I mostly just want, I tried to convey in my story, which was fairly long, the journey that we had to take, and we wanted to sort of show how difficult it is to get up there, if you're sort of an outsider like myself.
How many helicopter rides did you take?
We were on 3 helicopter rides, and I did not do well on the first helicopter ride. I'd never been on one before, and as soon as I got back on land, I vomited everywhere. and that got around the community pretty quick. And then, one lovely First Nation man I met, Tony McGrath, he's like, just if you ever get on a helicopter again, and at this point, I had no plans to get on one. We were originally going on a float plane in Nisquantiga, but then next thing you knew, I was on a helicopter the next day. Tony said, chew some gum, and I was okay. And I gotta say, this trip really was kind of transformative. We were in a helicopter flying along the Attawapskat, kind of going along with its banks and everything. And it really is something that all Canadians should see, should see how First Nations are living in these fly-in communities. Obviously, that's not possible. So I tried to do my best to convey what that was like through this kind of long, unique project that we work on, and which was, we applied for a grant from the Pulitzer Center to be able to actually do this, because it's, as you might guess, it's not cheap to go up there and take a bunch of flights and helicopter rides and things like that. So it was sort of a wonderful experience for me and my colleague. And it's so great to be able to get outside of Queen's Park, get outside the newsroom, and to see, what all the political power brokers are talking about. What's it like on the ground, So this was just really in that sort of vein. We did, half the job is just showing up. So we wanted to try to show up, and we managed to get there. And, I'm really proud of sort of the work that that we did up there.
Good for you. Can I express on behalf of Jean-Michael and myself how grateful we are that you did not projectile vomit all over the table here during the course of our interview. So we're delighted to have met you and spoken to you about this, and everything's still pretty neat here, which is good. That's Liam Casey from Canadian Press. Liam, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time now to take a look into the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what's up this week?
We've got a question from listener Matthew Silva, who writes, Hey there. With it still being early in 2026, I feel it's worth noting that 2025 was the first year since 1992 that John Turmel did not run for office. Turmel has, as some may know, is a perennial candidate who holds the record for most elections lost with 111 out of 113. Beyond his world record and cult status, I'm curious what legacy, if any, Turmel has left on the Ontario political scene. And we have here just a note that he finished 6th in a vote for a spot on the National Capital Freenet board, just as the board was being reduced from 7 seats to 5. And in 2008, he was running in a by-election that was canceled due to a general election, which he then ran in. Kind regards, Matthew Silva.
I've met this guy. I've been around a little bit, and
Yes.
so has he.
Yes.
And I remember, just probably going back 30, 40 years, I remember meeting John Turmel on the hustings, and he used to give a very funny kind of a speech. He would talk about mortgage rates. This is many years ago. And he would say, mortgage. Just look at that word in French, mortgage. It's a death gamble. That's what mortgages are. You're gambling with death. Anyway, he was a very colorful candidate. I don't think he ever really stood a chance of ever winning anything. And he was kind of, I don't want to say he was just comic relief in the races, because I know he did feel passionately about some issues.
Yes.
But I'm not sure he was ever in danger of prevailing. Let's put it that way.
So it will not surprise anybody to learn that he has a Wikipedia page. These kinds of characters often do. I don't know that his Wikipedia page has the exhaustive list of all of the races that he has run in, but if you sum up the number of votes he has received, at least in the list of races on his Wikipedia page, it comes to 33,000 votes in his lifetime. That is 33,000 more votes than I have ever received in an election.
But Not enough to get you elected.
It's true.
Anyway, John Turmel, one of the characters of our democracy, to be sure.
Yes. Again, if you'd like to ask about any content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, January 30th, 2026.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Please write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. And please be sure to include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
We always like to thank the crew for making the studio look so gorgeous. And now we're not talking about our temporary one on the 5th floor. We're here in the real deal now.
In a real studio.
Yeah,
yes.
It's pretty cool. So thanks, crew. We really appreciate your efforts. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.